A billionaire discovers a frail child lying at his doorstep, but what brings him to tears is the heartbreaking content of the letter attached. The rain was relentless, a downpour that seemed intent on washing the city clean of its sins. Karina pulled her shawl tighter around her, the thin fabric no match for the cold that bit into her skin. In her arms, Lua stirred faintly, her tiny lips quivering as she whimpered against the chill. The wrought iron gates of the mansion loomed ahead, a fortress of wealth and privilege that felt as unreachable as salvation. Karina hesitated, her breath fogging in the night air. What right did she have to approach this place? And yet, there was no other choice. She adjusted Lua, her hands trembling, and took the first step toward the grand oak doors. The world had not been kind to Karina. Her fingers, calloused and worn, told the story of long days spent scrubbing floors and stitching seams, trying to make a life for herself and her child. Lua had been her light, her reason to endure the relentless march of hardship. But tonight, under the weight of despair, Karina felt that light slipping from her grasp. Her thoughts churned as she walked, every memory a dagger. She saw herself at 17, brimming with naive hope, her dreams intertwined with a boy who promised forever. That promise dissolved the moment she told him she was pregnant. His words, sharp and final, echoed even now. "That's not my problem." Karina's grip tightened on Lua. The years that followed had been merciless. No family to turn to, no steady income, just endless nights of exhaustion and whispered lullabies to a baby who didn't yet know the world's cruelty. And now this, her own body betraying her with an illness she couldn't fight. The doctor's voice had been clinical, almost detached. "Late-stage lymphoma," he'd said. "Treatment options are limited, and time isn't on your side." Karina had barely heard the rest. Her mind had been consumed by one thought. Lua. The same cruel fate loomed over her daughter, though for Lua, there might still be a chance, if someone cared enough to try. Karina had spent every waking moment since wrestling with the impossible question: who would save her if I couldn't? Her answer stood before her now, shrouded in the warm glow of mansion lights. Bricho. His name carried weight in this city, whispered in stories of philanthropy and quiet acts of kindness. If anyone could help Lua, it was him. She had followed those stories, clinging to them like lifelines as she pieced together this desperate plan. Reaching the doorstep, Karina adjusted Lua again, her arms aching with a pain she refused to acknowledge. She knelt, placing her daughter gently in the basket she'd found at a thrift shop 2 days ago. The baby stirred, but didn't wake, her tiny hand brushing against the edge of Karina's shawl. A sob welled in Karina's throat, but she swallowed it. This wasn't about her grief. This was about giving Lua a chance, a sliver of hope in a world that had shown Karina none. She unfolded the letter she'd spent hours writing, each word a shard of her soul. She laid it atop the blanket, her handwriting shaky but legible. "To the kind man who lives here. Her name is Lua. She is my everything. I cannot give her the life she deserves, but I have heard that you are a man who helps others, a man with a heart big enough to save her when I cannot. Please, if you have any mercy, take her in. Fight for her in the way I wish I could. I am sorry, and I am grateful. Always. Her mother." Karina stared at the letter, her tears smudging the ink. For a moment, she considered taking Lua back, running far away from this place and keeping her daughter close, no matter the cost. But the reality was unyielding. Without someone like Bricho, Lua would have no chance at all. She stood, her knees weak, her heart heavier than it had ever been. She pressed her lips to Lua's forehead, her tears mingling with the rain that clung to the baby's soft skin. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please forgive me." The knock on the door was soft, hesitant, as though she feared it might shatter her resolve entirely. She lingered for a heartbeat longer, her body unwilling to move. Then, with one last look at the child who had given her life meaning, Karina turned and disappeared into the storm. The door remained closed, the mansion silent, but inside, the faintest sound began to stir. A cry, small and feeble, yet insistent. It pierced the quiet night, a beacon in the darkness. Lua's call for anyone willing to listen. Bricho rubbed his temples, the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing against his skull. The glow of his desk lamp bathed the mahogany surface in a muted light, casting sharp shadows across the report spread before him. Lines of numbers blurred together, relentless in their demand for attention. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, each drop a dull percussion in the symphony of a storm that had no end. He glanced at the clock, well past midnight. The rest of the mansion was silent, as it always was. Silence was his constant companion here, a vast emptiness filling the opulence that surrounded him. Bricho leaned back in his leather chair, its creak breaking the quiet. For all its grandeur, the room felt cold, lifeless. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. A sudden gust of wind rattled the glass panes, making him start. He turned toward the sound, frowning. The rain seemed heavier now, the howling wind weaving through the cracks of his fortress-like home. Bricho stood and approached the window, his reflection a faint silhouette against the darkness outside. Beyond the manicured lawn, the storm devoured the world. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible cry. He froze. The sound cut through the rhythm of rain and wind, fragile yet insistent. He tilted his head, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, and he wondered if his mind had conjured the sound, a trick played by fatigue and solitude. And then it came again, a tiny wail that lingered, filled with a piercing vulnerability. His brows knit together as unease coiled in his chest. He turned, grabbing the jacket slung over the back of his chair, and made his way to the front door. The hallway was dark, but he knew every corner of this house. It had been his for years, a monument to his success and his isolation. The heavy oak door creaked as he opened it, the chill of the storm immediately clawing at him. He stepped onto the porch, the wind tugging at his jacket, and peered into the night. His porch light flickered weakly against the downpour, illuminating only the stone steps and part of the drive beyond. But there it was again. The cry, louder now, urgent and raw. Bricho's gaze dropped to the edge of the light, where a small, bundled shape sat in a woven basket. His heart thudded against his ribs. He moved closer, the rain quickly soaking through his shoes. The bundle stirred, and he realized with a jolt what it was. A baby. A baby. On his doorstep. He crouched, his hands hovering over the basket as though afraid the fragile thing might shatter. The baby squirmed beneath the sodden blanket, her tiny fists curling and uncurling. Her face, flushed and damp, scrunched up as she let out another cry. Bricho hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, he could do nothing but stare. Then he saw the envelope tucked neatly beneath the folds of the blanket. The words on the front were smeared. He took the letter with unsteady hands, unfolding it carefully. The paper was thin, the ink slightly blurred, but the handwriting was deliberate, trembling in places. The last words trailed off, as though the writer had run out of strength. There was no signature, no indication of who had written it, or why they'd chosen his home. Bricho stared at the letter, its desperate plea echoing in his mind. The baby's cries pulled him back. Her tiny form shook against the cold, and he realized with a pang of guilt that she was freezing. Instinct took over. He slid his hands beneath her, lifting her carefully. She was impossibly light, her skin chilled through the damp blanket. Her crying softened as he brought her close, and for the first time in years, something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt since he lost his family. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The warmth of the house enveloped them both, though Bricho barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the fragile life in his arms. She opened her eyes, tiny and glassy, and stared up at him. He froze under her gaze, his heart lurching. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. There was something in her eyes, something that reached deep into him and refused to let go. It was as if she was asking him a question, one he didn't know how to answer. He placed her on the sofa, wrapping her more securely in the blanket. She let out a soft whimper, her fist finding her mouth. He stood over her, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? He wasn't a father. He wasn't even particularly good with children. His life was built on order, on control. This was chaos, and yet he couldn't bring himself to look away. The letter was still in his hand. He read it again, the words a heavy weight on his chest. She deserves a chance. A part of him wanted to call the authorities, to pass this responsibility to someone more equipped. But another part, the part that hadn't been silenced by years of loneliness, told him that wasn't right. Lua stirred, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Bricho knelt beside her, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know if he could give her what she needed. But the thought of turning his back on her now, it wasn't an option. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the storm outside. "But I promise, I'll try." The room was quiet again, save for the sound of rain against the windows. Bricho sat back, his gaze never leaving Lua. The world outside raged on, indifferent to the small miracle that had found its way to his doorstep. But within these walls, something was changing, something that would ripple far beyond this night. For now, he didn't think about the future. He didn't think about the weight of what he'd just taken on. All that mattered was the child in front of him, the fragile life he now held in his hands. The faint glow of dawn seeped through the heavy drapes of the mansion. But Bricho didn't notice. He sat in the corner of the living room, Lua cradled in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, her tiny chest rising and falling with a fragility that made his stomach clench. He hadn't slept. He hadn't dared. Every wheeze, every pause in her breathing jolted him into a state of hyper-awareness. The housekeeper arrived in the morning, her usual brisk demeanor softening when she saw Lua. "She doesn't look well, Mr. Bricho," she murmured, her voice tinged with concern. "I know," Bricho said, his voice heavy. "Get me the contact list for the best pediatricians and specialists in the city. I don't care who they are or where they work. I want someone here. Today." She nodded, her expression uncharacteristically subdued, and hurried off. Bricho held Lua closer, her warmth barely perceptible. He couldn't ignore the truth. She was deteriorating. The thought churned his stomach. By noon, the mansion bustled with activity, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the night before. Phones rang, voices spoke in hurried tones, and medical names Bricho couldn't pronounce filled the air. But despite his best efforts, the results were all the same. Polite refusals, hesitations, or outright dismissals. "This case is beyond our expertise," one doctor had said, his tone regretful but firm. Another suggested sending the baby to a specialized clinic, though none guaranteed results. Bricho slammed the phone down, frustration bubbling into anger. The helplessness gnawed at him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He was a man of action, a problem solver, someone who could bend the world to his will. Yet here he was, powerless against the tiny life slipping through his fingers. As the evening fell, Lua's condition worsened. Her once feeble cries had faded into silence, her small body limp in his arms. Panic clawed at Bricho's chest as he dialed yet another number, his hands trembling. "Stay calm," a voice on the other end instructed. It was an emergency doctor, one of the few willing to advise remotely. "If she starts convulsing, lay her on her side and make sure her airway is clear. Do you understand?" Bricho nodded, though the doctor couldn't see him. "Yes," he rasped. "I understand." The words had barely left his mouth when Lua's body jerked, her arms flailed weakly, and her face contorted as if in pain. Bricho froze for a moment, then sprang into action, laying her carefully on the sofa. "Lua, no," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay with me!" Her tiny form shook as the seizure took hold. He could hear the doctor's voice through the phone, calm but urgent, guiding him step by step. Bricho followed every instruction, his hands steady even as his mind screamed in terror. Lua lay still, her breathing faint but steady. Bricho stared at her, his chest heaving. He couldn't do this alone. She needed real help now. The car roared to life as Bricho sped through the rain-slick streets. Lua was bundled in blankets in the back seat, her fragile form barely visible in the dim light. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Just hold on," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Hold on a little longer." The rain lashed against the windshield, blurring his vision. He barely registered the red lights or the honking horns as he weaved through traffic. All he could think about was the stillness of Lua's tiny body and the words of the doctor earlier. "She doesn't have much time." The emergency room was a cacophony of sound and light. Nurses moved quickly, their voices clipped and professional, as they took Lua from Bricho's arms. He followed them as far as he was allowed, before being stopped at the doors of the pediatric intensive care unit. "You have to stay here, sir," a nurse said firmly. Her eyes softened at the look of desperation on his face. "We'll do everything we can." Bricho stood rooted to the spot, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to demand answers, to barge through those doors and make sure Lua was being taken care of. But all he could do was wait. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Bricho sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands. The sterile smell of the hospital clawed at his senses, a stark reminder of how helpless he was. Every now and then he glanced at the doors, hoping for some news, any news. When the doctor finally appeared, Bricho shot to his feet. "How is she?" he demanded, his voice raw with emotion. The doctor hesitated, his face grim. "Lua's condition is critical. She's stable for now, but the underlying problem is severe. Without aggressive treatment, I'm afraid the prognosis isn't good." Bricho's stomach dropped. "There must be something you can do." "There's an experimental treatment," the doctor said slowly. "It's risky, and there are no guarantees. But if we don't try, she won't make it." Bricho didn't hesitate. "Do it," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The doctor nodded, his expression serious. "We'll start immediately, but you should prepare yourself. This will be a long and difficult road." Bricho watched as the doctor disappeared back through the doors, his heart heavy. He sank into the nearest chair, exhaustion washing over him. For the first time in years he prayed, not to any god in particular, but to the universe, to fate, to anything that might listen. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking, "don't take her away from me." As the hours dragged on, Bricho's mind wandered. He thought of the letter left with Lua, the plea for help that had led her to his doorstep. He thought of her mother, a stranger whose desperation mirrored his own. And he thought of Lua, her tiny hand gripping his finger, her eyes filled with a silent question he still didn't know how to answer. The night wore on, and Bricho remained in that chair, waiting. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up. Not on Lua. Not now. Not ever. The small hospital chapel was a sanctuary of quiet amidst the chaos. Bricho sat alone on the wooden pew, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed low. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames casting soft shadows that danced in rhythm with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Outside the stained glass windows, the storm raged on, but inside, the air was heavy with an almost suffocating stillness. He hadn't prayed in years, not since the accident. The memories of that day, the twisted metal, the shattered glass, the stillness that followed, rose unbidden in his mind, choking him. He clenched his fists, forcing the thoughts down. This wasn't about the past. This was about Lua. "I don't even know if anyone's listening," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "But if you are, please don't take her. Don't take her too." His words dissolved into the quiet, swallowed by the chapel's solemn atmosphere. He looked up, his eyes scanning the altar. The figure of the Virgin Mary gazed back at him, serene and distant. For a moment, he felt foolish. What good were prayers in the face of science and medicine? And yet, he had nothing else to give. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. He turned to see a man standing at the entrance, his white coat slightly rumpled, a stethoscope draped around his neck. The man was tall and lean, his hair streaked with grey, his face marked by years of long nights and impossible cases. He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak, before stepping inside. "You're Lua's guardian?" the man asked, his voice low but steady. Bricho stood, nodding. "Yes. How is she?" The doctor approached, his expression unreadable. "My name is Ernesto," he said, offering a hand. Bricho shook it, his grip firm but desperate. "I heard about her case from the ICU team. It's complicated." Bricho's chest tightened. He had grown to hate that word. Complicated. It was the kind of word people used when they wanted to soften the blow of something unbearable. "I don't care how complicated it is," he said sharply. "Just tell me there's something you can do." Ernesto studied him for a moment before nodding toward the pews. "Let's sit." Reluctantly, Bricho followed, his body tense as he lowered himself back onto the wooden bench. Ernesto leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "Lua's condition is critical," he began. "Her immune system is failing, likely due to a rare genetic disorder. Conventional treatments aren't enough. But..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There's an experimental therapy. It's still in its early stages, and the risks are significant." "What kind of risks?" Bricho asked, his voice sharp. "Rejection, infection, organ failure." Ernesto met his gaze, his tone frank but compassionate. "The therapy involves stem cell transplantation, paired with a drug protocol that hasn't been widely tested. The success rate is low, and even if it works, the recovery process will be long and uncertain." Bricho's jaw tightened. "And if we don't try?" Ernesto's silence was answer enough. For a moment, Bricho couldn't speak. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating in its enormity. He looked at the altar again, his mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. He thought of Lua's fragile form, her tiny hand clutching his finger. He thought of the letter left on his doorstep, the plea for help that had brought her into his life. And then he thought of the night he had lost his wife and daughter, the helplessness that had consumed him as he stood by, unable to save them. He couldn't let that happen again, not to Lua. "We'll do it," he said finally, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "Whatever it takes." Ernesto nodded, his expression unreadable. "It won't be easy. You'll need to be prepared for setbacks. For a fight." "I'll fight," Bricho said, his voice steady. "For her, I'll fight." The next few days passed in a blur of medical jargon, consent forms, and sleepless nights. Lua was moved to a sterile, brightly lit room in the ICU, her tiny body dwarfed by the machines that beeped and hummed around her. Bricho stayed by her side, his chair pulled close to the bed. He rarely left, surviving on stale coffee and sheer determination. The first round of treatment began with a series of tests. Lua's tiny veins were pricked and prodded, her body subjected to procedures that made her cry out in pain. Each cry was a dagger to Bricho's heart, but he forced himself to stay calm, to soothe her with soft words and a steady hand. "It's okay, Lua," he whispered, stroking her hair. "You're stronger than this, stronger than me." Ernesto visited often, his presence a mix of reassurance and reality checks. "She's responding well so far," he said one evening, his tone cautious. "But it's still early. We won't know for sure until the next phase." Bricho nodded, his gaze never leaving Lua. "I trust you," he said quietly. "Just don't give up on her." "We won't," Ernesto promised, "but she's going to need you. More than ever." As the days turned into weeks, Bricho found himself changing. The man who had once thrived on control and detachment now lived for the small moments. Lua's fingers curling around his, the faint flush that returned to her cheeks, the quiet hum of her breathing as she slept. He spoke to her often, his voice soft and filled with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. "You're a fighter, you know that," he said one night, his hand resting lightly on her chest. "You've already done more in your little life than most people do in a lifetime. And I'm not going anywhere. Not until you're running circles around me." Lua stirred, her tiny mouth twitching as if in response. Bricho smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and fear. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. For Lua. The sterile hum of machines filled the small room, a symphony of beeping monitors and the faint hiss of oxygen. Lua lay in the hospital crib, her tiny body connected to an array of wires and tubes. The fluorescent lights above bathed the space in a stark white glow, amplifying every shadow and every line of worry etched into Bricho's face. It had been weeks since the treatment began, weeks of watching Lua fight a battle her frail body seemed too small to endure. Her condition had swung wildly between moments of progress and crushing setbacks. Each day began with hope and ended in exhaustion, leaving Bricho with a gnawing sense of helplessness that threatened to undo him. One night, the beeping of the heart monitor took on a frantic rhythm. Bricho, who had been dozing in the chair by Lua's bed, shot upright. Her small form convulsed, her limbs trembling uncontrollably as the color drained from her face. "Lua!" he cried, his voice raw with panic. He slammed the emergency button, and within seconds, nurses and doctors flooded the room. "Seizure," one of them called out. "Administer diazepam, 0.2 milligram." Bricho was pushed aside, forced to watch helplessly as they worked to stabilize her. Time slowed, each second stretching into an eternity as he clung to the doorframe, his fists clenched so tightly, his nails dug into his palms. Ernesto arrived moments later, his face a mask of calm urgency. He barked orders with precision, his hands steady as he adjusted the ventilator. "She's fighting," he said under his breath, though Bricho wasn't sure if the words were meant for him or for Lua. The minutes dragged on until finally the convulsions subsided. Lua lay still, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ernesto turned to Bricho, his expression grave but steady. "She's stable for now," he said. "But this is the critical phase. We need to push forward with the next treatment cycle immediately. Bricho nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He returned to Lua's bedside as the team cleared out, his hand trembling as he gently touched her forehead. Her skin was clammy, her tiny face pale and drawn. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you, Lua." The next few days were no easier. Lua's body reacted violently to the treatments, her immune system fighting the intervention even as it tried to repair itself. There were nights when Bricho feared the worst, his heart pounding with every irregular beep of the monitor. But there were also moments, small, fleeting moments, that gave him hope. A slight twitch of her fingers, a faint flush returning to her cheeks. He clung to those signs like lifelines, refusing to let despair take hold. Ernesto remained a constant presence, his calm demeanor anchoring Bricho through the storm. "She's a fighter," he said one evening, as they reviewed her latest test results. "I've seen cases like this before. The ones who make it are the ones who fight." Bricho nodded, his eyes never leaving Lua. "She's stronger than she looks." One morning, after another sleepless night, Bricho sat slumped in the chair by Lua's bed. His head rested on the edge of the crib, his fingers lightly curled around hers. The room was quiet, the soft rhythm of the monitors the only sound. He stirred as he felt movement beneath his hand. Lua's tiny fingers twitched, then wrapped weakly around his. His eyes flew open, and for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it. But then he saw her eyes, half open, bleary, but unmistakably alive. A soft gurgle escaped her lips, followed by the faintest twitch of her mouth. A smile. It was small, fleeting, and barely there, but it was a smile. Bricho froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The world seemed to tilt, everything narrowing to this one. Perfect moment. "Lua," he whispered, his voice trembling. Tears filled his eyes as he leaned closer, his free hand gently brushing her cheek. "You're still here." Her smile faded as her eyes fluttered shut again, exhaustion overtaking her. But she was breathing, steady and sure. Bricho exhaled shakily, a laugh escaping him, a laugh filled with relief and disbelief. Ernesto entered moments later, his brow furrowing as he took in Bricho's expression. "What happened?" "She smiled," Bricho said, his voice thick with emotion. "She smiled at me." Ernesto approached the crib, his eyes scanning Lua's vitals. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Her body's responding," he said softly. "It's early, but this is a good sign." Bricho nodded, his hand still clasping Lua's. He felt a warmth in his chest, a weight lifting that he hadn't realized he was carrying. For the first time in weeks, hope felt tangible, real. In the days that followed, Lua's condition steadily improved. Her color returned, her movements grew stronger, and the machines that had once been her lifeline began to fade into the background. Each small victory, her first laugh, her first attempt to grasp his finger, felt monumental, a testament to her resilience. Bricho found himself smiling more, laughing even. He spoke to Lua constantly, telling her stories about the world outside the hospital, about the life he hoped to share with her one day. "You've got so much to see," he said one afternoon, his voice filled with wonder. "And I'm going to be there for all of it." The nurses began to notice the change in him, exchanging knowing glances as they passed by. The man, who had once been stoic and distant, now lingered by the crib, his every word and action laced with tenderness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bricho sat with Lua, cradled in his arms. The monitors had been removed, the wires replaced by the soft warmth of her tiny body against his chest. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, her lips curling into another smile. In that moment, Brico felt something shift. Lua wasn't just a responsibility, a fragile life he had taken on out of duty or guilt. She was his. A part of him that he hadn't realized was missing until now. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his heart full to bursting. "You're not just my miracle, Lua," he whispered. "You're my everything." The room was quiet, the storm outside finally abating, and for the first time, Brico felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The sun filtered gently through the tall windows of the mansion, casting golden rays across the polished wooden floors. The stillness of the morning was serene, a stark contrast to the stormy chaos of recent weeks. Brico stirred awake in his room, the faint hum of birdsong outside breaking through the fog of sleep. His first thought, as always, was Lua. He reached for the baby monitor on the nightstand, its quiet static a reassurance he had grown to depend on. But today, it was silent. Frowning, he sat up, his heart skipping a beat. The silence was wrong. He hurried out of bed, the cool floorboards pressing against his bare feet as he rushed down the hallway toward Lua's room. "Lua," he called softly, pushing open the door. The crib was empty. His breath caught, panic surging through him. He scanned the room, his mind racing. The blanket that Lua had been wrapped in the night before lay folded neatly on the mattress, as though she had never been there. "Lua!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the vast halls of the mansion. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tore through the house, checking every room, every corner where she might have been taken. The staff, startled by his frantic movements, joined the search, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. Brico's mind spiraled with dread. Had someone broken in? Taken her? But why? And how had they managed to get past the mansion's security unnoticed? He finally stopped in the living room, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the edge of a chair for support. Then he heard it, a soft murmur coming from the library. His head snapped toward the sound, his body tense as he moved quickly toward the door. He pushed it open and froze. A woman sat on the floor, cradling Lua in her arms. Her dark hair was damp, clinging to her face, and her clothes were rumpled as if she had been traveling for days. Lua lay nestled against her, calm and quiet, her small hand grasping a strand of the woman's hair. The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling. Brico's body moved before his mind caught up, crossing the room in swift strides. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp, his eyes locked on Lua. "What are you doing with her?" The woman held Lua tighter, her gaze pleading. "I'm her mother. My name is Karina." Brico stopped, the name ringing. The letter, the desperate handwriting. He stared at her, his chest tightening. "Karina," he repeated, his voice quieter now. "You left her on my doorstep. Why are you here now?" Tears welled in Karina's eyes, but she didn't look away. I had to see her. I couldn't stay away any longer. I thought I could. But every day, I felt like I was losing a part of myself." She looked down at Lua, her fingers brushing gently against the baby's cheek. "She's my everything." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, Brico saw not a stranger, but a mother who had been stretched to her breaking point. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Karina continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought leaving her with someone like you would give her a chance. But I was wrong. I can't—" Her breath hitched. "I can't live without her." Brico's initial fury ebbed, replaced by a wave of conflicting emotions. He crouched down, his eyes level with Karina's. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his tone a mixture of anger and exasperation. "Do you know how much danger you put her in by sneaking in like this?" Karina flinched, her grip on Lua tightening. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I didn't know if I'd ever see her again. Bricho rubbed a hand over his face, trying to rein in his frustration. And what if you'd woken her? What if something had happened to her while you were sneaking around? She's been through hell, Karina. She's still recovering. I know, Karina said, her voice breaking. I know I was selfish. But I had to see her. I had to hold her just once more. Bricho sighed, his anger softening as he saw the raw emotion in her eyes. He sat back on his heels, his gaze shifting to Lua, who looked up at him with a contented expression, as if oblivious to the tension around her. She's stronger than I ever imagined, Bricho said softly, his voice carrying a note of pride. She's fought so hard to be here. Karina nodded, tears streaming down her face. Because of you. You saved her. Bricho shook his head. No, she saved herself. I was just there. The room fell into silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. Finally, Bricho spoke again. You need to tell me everything, Karina. Why you left her, why you came back, and what you plan to do now. Karina hesitated, then nodded, her shoulders slumping as though a great weight had been lifted. I'll tell you everything, she said, but please, let me hold her a little longer. Lua lay peacefully in her crib nearby, her soft coos filling the silence as Bricho and Karina sat across from each other. The tension between them was palpable, as if the unspoken words hung in the air like a fragile thread ready to snap. Bricho leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, eyes locked on Karina. You said you'd explain everything, he reminded her, his voice firm but calm. Why now? Why after all this time? Karina hesitated, her fingers clutching the hem of her worn sweater. Her face was pale, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she had carried for far too long. I didn't want to leave her, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing, but it was killing me. Bricho studied her, his expression unreadable. And sneaking into my house. That was your idea of making things right. I didn't plan it, Karina admitted, looking down at her hands. I wanted to see her, to know if she was safe. I wasn't expecting... Her voice faltered, her gaze drifting toward Lua, whose tiny hand peeked out from under her blanket. Bricho sighed, running a hand through his hair. You put her at risk, Karina. She's been through too much. I know, Karina interrupted, her voice trembling. But I've been through too much, too. She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you think it was easy for me to leave her, to walk away from my own daughter? Every night I wondered if I'd made the right choice, if I'd ever see her again. And now... She trailed off, her shoulders sagging. Her breathing grew labored, and a faint sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead. Karina. Bricho's voice sharpened as he noticed her growing pallor. Are you all right? I'm fine, she murmured, shaking her head. But her hand trembled as it reached for the edge of the sofa, her knuckles turning white. I just need... Her sentence ended abruptly as her eyes fluttered shut, and her body went limp, slumping forward. Karina! Bricho shouted, lunging to catch her before she fell. His heart pounded as he eased her onto the floor, her face ashen and her breathing shallow. Stay with me, he urged, his voice laced with panic. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, finding a faint, erratic pulse. Without wasting another second, Bricho scooped her into his arms and carried her to the front door. Stay here with Lua, he barked at the stunned housekeeper as he rushed past her. She nodded wordlessly, her face pale with shock. The tires screeched as Bricho's car swerved through the city streets. He drove like a man possessed, weaving through traffic with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping Karina's icy hand. Her head rested against the passenger seat, her breaths shallow and uneven. "Hold on, Karina," he muttered, his voice tight with desperation. "Just hold on." The hospital came into view, its emergency room entrance glowing like a beacon. Bricho pulled up to the curb and jumped out, shouting for help. Two nurses and a stretcher appeared almost instantly, their movements efficient as they transferred Karina inside. "What happened?" one of them asked as they wheeled her away. "She collapsed," Bricho said, his voice raw. "She's been weak for weeks, months maybe. I think it's serious." The nurse nodded, her expression grave. "We'll take it from here, sir. Please wait outside." The waiting room was a cold, impersonal space, its walls painted a sterile shade of beige. Bricho paced back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. Memories of Lua's time in the ICU flashed through his mind, the helplessness and fear threatening to consume him once again. He couldn't lose Karina, not after everything. Minutes stretched into an eternity before a doctor emerged, his face grim. Bricho stopped mid-step, his stomach twisting. "Mr. Bricho?" the doctor asked. "Yes," Bricho said quickly. "How is she?" "She's in critical condition," the doctor said, his tone steady but grave. "Her body is severely weakened, likely from months of untreated illness." Bricho's heart sank. The word hit him like a blow, heavy and unforgiving. "What? What can you do for her?" "We're stabilizing her for now," the doctor continued, "but her condition is precarious. Without immediate intervention, she won't survive." Bricho swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Do whatever you have to. I don't care about the cost. Just save her." The doctor nodded. "We'll do our best." Hours passed in agonizing silence. Bricho sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands. The sterile smell of the hospital filled his senses, a grim reminder of the fragile line between life and death. He thought of Lua, her tiny smile a beacon of hope, and Karina's tearful confession earlier that morning. He couldn't let her die, not when she had fought so hard to be here. Finally, the doctor returned, his expression weary. "She's stable for now," he said, "but the cancer is advanced. We'll need to start aggressive treatment immediately if there's any chance of saving her." Bricho nodded, his resolve hardening. "Do it," he said, his voice firm. "She's not going anywhere." The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Bricho, the road ahead will be difficult, and even with treatment, the prognosis—" "I don't care," Bricho interrupted. "Just save her." The doctor met his gaze, then nodded. "We'll start right away." Bricho returned to Karina's room once she was moved from the emergency ward. She lay motionless on the bed, her face pale and fragile against the crisp white sheets. The sight of her like this stirred something deep within him, a mix of anger, sadness, and a fierce determination to fight for her, the way he had fought for Lua. He pulled a chair close to her bedside, his hand resting gently on hers. "You're not done here, Karina," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Lua needs you, and so do I." The sterile, oppressive atmosphere of the hospital waiting room was a cruel reminder of how little control Bricho had over the situation. He paced relentlessly, his footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors as he cast nervous glances toward the double doors that led to the intensive care unit. Every tick of the wall clock felt like an eternity. His mind raced as he thought of Karina, her face pale, her body frail, yet still clinging to life. He couldn't lose her. Not now, not after everything they had been through. He had fought so hard to save Lua, and now, against all odds, she was thriving. He wouldn't let death take Karina when there was still a chance, no matter how slim. The doors swung open and Ernesto stepped out, his white coat rumpled, his face lined with fatigue. Bricho stopped mid-step and turned to him, his heart pounding. "She's stable for now," Ernesto said, his tone measured but grim. "But her condition is critical. We've confirmed advanced lymphoma. Without aggressive intervention, she won't make it." Bricho swallowed hard, nodding. "Then let's intervene." Ernesto's expression darkened. "Bricho, you know what this entails. The treatment we used for Lua is experimental, dangerous. Karina's body is already severely weakened. There's no guarantee she'll survive the process." "She doesn't have a choice," Bricho said firmly, "and neither do we." Karina stirred faintly in the hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open to find Bricho sitting at her bedside. He looked haggard, his suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, but his gaze was steady and full of determination. "What happened?" she asked weakly, her voice barely a whisper. "You collapsed," Bricho said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been sick for a long time, haven't you? And you didn't tell anyone." Karina tried to sit up but winced, her strength failing her. "It doesn't matter," she murmured. I can't be a burden to you. Or to Lua." Bricho leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "A burden? You think that's what this is about?" His voice cracked with frustration. "You're her mother, Karina. She needs you. And whether you believe it or not, I need you too." Karina's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "I've already taken too much. You've done enough." "Stop," Bricho said, his tone softening as he reached for her hand. "You gave me Lua. You trusted me with her life. Do you think I could live with myself if I didn't do everything I could to save you too?" Karina turned her head away, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I'm scared," she admitted, after a long pause. "What if it doesn't work?" Bricho squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll fight like hell until it does." The treatment began the next day. Ernesto worked tirelessly with his team, preparing Karina for the grueling process. Bricho stayed by her side, his presence a constant source of strength as she endured needle after needle, test after test. The treatment was even harsher on her than it had been on Lua. Her body, already ravaged by illness, struggled to keep up. There were nights when Bricho thought they would lose her. Her breathing would falter, or her fever would spike, and alarms would blare as nurses and doctors rushed to her side. Each time, Bricho stood in the corner of the room, his fists clenched, his heart pounding as he willed her to keep fighting. In the quiet moments, when the machines beeped steadily and the nurses had left, he spoke to her, his voice low and filled with emotion. "You know, Lua smiled at me for the first time a few weeks ago," he said one night, his hand resting lightly on hers. It wasn't much, a little twitch of her lips, but it felt like the world stopped for a moment. "She's stronger than anyone gives her credit for. Just like you." Karina didn't respond. She was unconscious, her body too weak to do much more than breathe. But Bricho kept talking, pouring out the thoughts he had held back for so long. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed," he continued. "A reason to care. A reason to keep going. Lua isn't just a responsibility. She's my family. And whether you like it or not, that makes you my family too." His voice cracked, and he leaned closer, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "So, you're going to fight, Karina. For Lua. For me. For yourself. Because this world isn't done with you yet." The days blurred into nights, and the nights into weeks. Karina's condition wavered between moments of stability and terrifying declines. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to improve. Her fever subsided. Her color returned. The machines that had once been her lifeline grew quieter, less intrusive. Bricho remained by her side through it all, just as he had with Lua. He brought Lua to visit on days when Karina was strong enough to see her, the baby's bright smile a beacon of hope in the sterile hospital room. Karina would cry softly as she held her daughter, whispering promises of a future she wasn't sure she could give, but desperately wanted to try for. Ernesto checked in regularly, his expression cautious, but increasingly optimistic. "She's responding better than we expected," he said one morning as Bricho hovered over Karina's bed. "It's still early, but she has a chance." Bricho nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ernesto clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Thank her. She's the one fighting." One evening, as the hospital quieted and the city's lights sparkled in the distance, Karina stirred awake. Bricho, who had been dozing in the chair beside her, straightened immediately. "Hey," he said softly, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" Karina blinked slowly, her gaze meeting his. "Tired," she whispered, "but alive." Bricho smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You scared the hell out of me, you know." Karina managed a weak chuckle, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Bricho said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll stick around," he said, his hand tightening around hers. "Lua needs her mum, and I need you, too." Karina's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "I promise." For the first time in weeks, Bricho allowed himself to believe that promise. And in that moment, as Karina drifted back to sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of early morning sunlight filtering through the sheer hospital curtains. The machines that had once hummed incessantly around Karina now sat idle, their lights dimmed, a testament to her progress. Her breathing, steady and deep, filled the space, accompanied only by the faint rustle of Lua's playful movements in a crib nearby. Bricho sat in a chair by the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. He watched Karina, her face serene in sleep, though faint traces of exhaustion still lingered. There was a fragility to her now, one that mirrored the same fight he had witnessed in Lua just weeks before. But there was also strength, a quiet resilience that refused to fade. As if sensing his thoughts, Karina stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she turned her head toward him, her lips parting slightly. "Bricho." Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He leaned closer, his eyes softening. "I'm here." Her gaze drifted to the crib, where Lua gurgled happily, gripping a small plush toy. A faint smile touched Karina's lips, though it faltered as her eyes welled with tears. "She's okay," she murmured, as though reassuring herself. "She's more than okay," Bricho said, his tone warm. "She's thriving, and it's because of you." Karina shook her head weakly, her voice breaking. "It's because of you. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he replied. "But if you're going to thank anyone, thank yourself. You gave her the chance to fight. You gave her life." She closed her eyes, her tears slipping down her cheeks. "I almost lost her. I almost lost everything." Bricho reached out, his hand covering hers. "But you didn't. You're both here. That's what matters." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy with unspoken words. Karina opened her eyes again, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Do you know why I left her with you?" she asked, quietly. Bricho leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I've wondered." Karina exhaled shakily, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I grew up in a world where survival was the only goal. My parents. They didn't care about me. They barely cared about themselves. I learned early on that no one was going to save me. When I found out I was pregnant with Lua, I told myself I'd do better, that I'd give her a life worth living. She paused, her throat tightening. But then I got sick, and I realized I couldn't give her anything. I couldn't even guarantee she'd survive. So I did the only thing I could think of. I found someone who could. Bricho's chest ached at the pain in her voice. You thought I was better for her than you were. You are, she said firmly, turning her head to look at him. You have everything I couldn't give her. Security, stability, love. His jaw tightened, his eyes glinting with emotion. She doesn't need all of that. She needs you. And so do I. Karina's breath caught. She searched his face, confusion and something deeper flickering in her eyes. What are you saying? Bricho ran a hand through his hair, his voice faltering for the first time. I've spent years pushing people away. After my wife and daughter, I didn't think I had anything left to give. But then Lua came into my life. And then you came back. He swallowed hard, his eyes locking onto hers. You've both shown me that I still have something worth fighting for, something worth living for, and I'm not going to let either of you go. Tears spilled down Karina's cheeks as she listened, her heart aching with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Bricho, I don't know if I can be what you and Lua need. You already are, he said, his voice steady. You've fought harder than anyone I've ever known. You've given everything for her, and now you have a chance to be there for her, for us. If you'll let yourself. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over them. Karina turned her head, her eyes drifting to Lua. The little girl giggled, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, her tiny fingers clutching the plush toy as though it was her whole world. I thought leaving her with you was the best thing I could do, Karina said softly. But I was wrong. The best thing I can do is stay. Bricho reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Then stay. We'll figure everything out together. Karina nodded, her resolve hardening. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The room grew warmer, filled with the soft sounds of Lua's play and the occasional murmured conversation between Bricho and Karina. For the first time in years, Karina felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, a sense of belonging. Later that evening, as the light outside began to fade, she looked at Bricho, her voice quiet but certain. You saved us both, you know. He shook his head. No, you saved us. You gave us a reason to fight. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared pain and newfound hope, creating a bond that neither of them had expected. Lua let out a small laugh, her eyes sparkling as she reached for Karina's outstretched hand. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, painting the marble floors in golden hues. Outside, the gardens brimmed with life. The scent of fresh flowers floated through the air, mingling with the soft chirping of birds as they darted between the branches of ancient oak trees. In the dining room, Lua sat in her high chair, clapping her tiny hands as Karina spooned mashed bananas onto her plate. The little girl giggled, her face smeared with the sticky sweetness of her breakfast. Bricho sat across from them. A newspaper folded on the table next to his coffee cup, but his attention was fixed entirely on the scene before him. She's a natural disaster when it comes to food, Bricho said with a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. Karina laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She gets that from me. I was a nightmare at this age. You? Bricho teased, raising an eyebrow. I find that hard to believe. Oh, don't let the calm exterior fool you, Karina shot back, a playful grin tugging at her lips. "I was chaos incarnate," Lua squealed, her tiny voice breaking into the easy banter between them. She slapped her hands on the tray of her high chair, beaming at the sound it made. Both Bricho and Karina turned to her, their laughter filling the room. Later, in the garden, Karina knelt beside Lua, her hands gently guiding the toddler's unsteady steps across the soft grass. The little girl wobbled, giggling with every step as she clung to her mother's fingers. Nearby, Bricho worked on pruning a rose bush, his sleeves rolled up and a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "She's getting stronger every day," Karina said, her voice filled with pride as she glanced at Bricho. "I still can't believe how far she's come." "She's a fighter," Bricho replied without looking up, "just like her mother." Karina blushed, turning her attention back to Lua. "It's all because of you, Bricho. None of this would have been possible without you." He stood, wiping his hands on a cloth, and walked over to where they were. "You keep saying that," he said gently, crouching down beside them. "But the truth is, you both saved me. I didn't even realize how much I'd been missing until you came into my life." Karina met his gaze, her heart swelling with emotion. "And I didn't realize how much I needed someone to believe in me until you did." Lua, oblivious to the weight of their words, let out a delighted shriek and plopped down onto the grass. The moment dissolved into laughter as both Bricho and Karina reached for her, their hands brushing as they helped the little girl to her feet. As the day stretched on, the three of them found themselves on the back porch. Bricho sat on the swing, Lua nestled in his lap, while Karina curled up beside them with a book. The soft creak of the swing and the rustle of leaves in the breeze were the only sounds, a peaceful melody that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Lua's eyes began to flutter closed, her small head resting against Bricho's chest. He looked down at her, his expression softening. "She's out," he murmured. Karina smiled, closing her book. "She's had a big day. She'll sleep well tonight." Bricho glanced at her, his gaze lingering. "So will I," he said quietly. "For the first time in years, I actually feel at peace." Karina reached out, her hand brushing against his. "Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the three of them moved to the garden. Lua had woken from her nap, refreshed and full of energy. She toddled ahead of them, her laughter ringing out as she chased a butterfly that flitted just out of reach. Bricho and Karina followed at a leisurely pace, their shoulders brushing as they walked. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The unspoken bond between them, forged through hardship and love, was enough. Eventually, Lua plopped down in the middle of the flower beds, her tiny hands reaching for the blooms around her. Bricho and Karina joined her, the three of them sitting together as the world grew quieter. Bricho looked at them, Karina's soft smile, Lua's bright eyes, and felt a surge of something he hadn't known in years, pure, unfiltered happiness. This was his family, imperfect, unexpected, but perfect in its own way. Karina turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Bricho, for everything." He shook his head, his lips curving into a smile. "Thank you, for giving me a reason to hope again." As the last rays of sunlight bathed the garden in golden light, Lua reached for both of them, her small hands grasping theirs. In that moment, nothing else mattered. They were together, and they were whole. For the first time, Bricho, Karina, and Lua weren't just three people brought together by chance. They were a family, a home. And as they sat there, the laughter and love flowing freely between them, they knew the future, no matter what it held, was theirs to face together.